So, the title of my talk today is Scientism, what it is, where it came from, and why it matters. How many have heard the term Scientism? Sorry. Cool. So, in typical academic fashion, I'm just going to read it. Modern Western society adores science. Since the scientific revolution in the 1500s and 1600s, European and American society has dedicated a tremendous amount of effort to identifying, extricating, and discarding non-scientific beliefs that they may be replaced with scientific ones. This trend continues today, and although in the last several decades it has met with a new kind of resistance from the likes of post-structuralists and postmodernists and cultural relativists, in that same time period we've seen the rise of the new atheists and others, among whom it has risen to a deafening pitch, such that today we are often confronted with an ideology that many contemporary scholars and writers have labeled scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is our most reliable or only reliable source of knowledge. Under scientism, there are two types of belief, scientific ones and non-scientific ones. A scientific belief is accepted, or at least not rejected, by a majority of the contemporary scientific community, and a non-scientific belief is anything else, including beliefs about which science is silent. Scientism dictates that when two beliefs conflict, a man is intellectually obligated to accept the more scientific one and reject the less scientific one. If neither is sufficiently scientific, he must rely on his own private, subjective convictions to choose between the two. But the choice is viewed as arbitrary, so he has no social power whatsoever to defend his choice to others or suggest they follow suit. Questions that cannot be answered scientifically must be answered on a private and individual basis. This manifests concretely in society when our political decision makers in Congress, our legal decision makers in the courts, and our educational decision makers in the classrooms turn to scientists to give the authoritative verdict on what they should or shouldn't do. It also manifests in our fiery hatred of pseudoscience, because calling something science that isn't, in a society like ours that sets such great store by science, can result in catastrophe. And on a personal level, many of us tend to solve, or attempt to solve, many of our everyday problems scientifically. When we are burning out at work, or when we feel lonely and socially isolated, or when we don't know how to parent our children, we most often turn less to family traditions or religious traditions or any kind of tradition, but rather to the latest popular science bestseller on the topic. These are the marks of scientism on society. So why does scientism matter? Scientism suffers a couple major problems, the severest being when a society that embraces scientism cannot cleanly distinguish science from its opposite. But my focus in this talk is not on the problems of scientism. That was my thesis. My focus in this talk is on what scientism, as a product of Western culture, reveals about Western culture. So what makes science more reliable than everything else? That's the big question when somebody accepts scientism. What sets science apart? If science is our only or our best, right, our best or our only reliable source of knowledge, what makes it more reliable than history or philosophy or art or literature or religion? What distinguishes it? The most obvious answer is the astounding accomplishments of science. Science put a man on the moon, it cured smallpox, and perhaps most impressively, it engineered the hostess Twinkie. But if we look at the history of Western society, we developed our high regard for science before science had done any of these things. We developed it around the time that scientific observations suggested that the Earth might not be the center of the universe. Not super impressive. Thus, there must be some other reason that we as a society came to value science so highly, and that's what I want to explore today. In order to do this, we have to answer the question, what is science and how does it work? Unfortunately, that is a nearly impossible task. In just the last couple centuries of Western philosophy, the likes of Auguste Comte, Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, and innumerable other brilliant scholars have tried and failed to pin down exactly what science is and how it works. They have offered definitions of science that either exclude things that should be included, like nutrition and theoretical physics, or include things that should be excluded, like astrology and the humanities. They have described the scientific method as an orderly and predictable set of steps, when in fact either many steps are skipped most of the time or taken out of order, or there are no steps at all. These scholars have lauded science as an eminently rational and objective enterprise, when in fact it is frequently influenced by profit and power like everything else, and has at times been significantly advanced under the influence of wild dreams or hallucinogenic drugs, both great examples, the benzene ring and DNA. Some scholars, like Thomas Kuhn, for those of you who are familiar, have done justice to the complexity and variety of science. I would argue primarily because he's a historian and not a philosopher. But generally speaking, scholars who have tried to characterize science have oversimplified a discipline that stubbornly remains complex. But fortunately, the question we have to answer is not so much what science is and how it works, but rather what science is perceived to be and how science is perceived to work. It is our perceptions of science that shape our attitudes towards science, and since I'm here investigating what our attitudes towards science reveal about our culture, I care less about the complex reality and more about the simplistic perceptions. So some of what I'm about to say is on target, and some of it may be hard to know, but I would argue that all of it captures, at least at a high level, how Western society has perceived science for the last 400 years. Science is first and foremost a human activity. It's something we do. In particular, science is the activity of seeking explanations for natural phenomena based on established natural laws, or of seeking to establish the laws themselves. The activity of science consists of iterating over the canon of scientific knowledge to further and further refine our understanding of the natural world. As we move from the miasma theory of disease to the germ theory of disease, or from geocentrism to heliocentrism, or from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. Scientists iterate over the canon of scientific knowledge by repeating a set of investigatory steps that we call the scientific method. The scientific method consists of 4 steps: observation, prediction, experimentation, and induction. A note on prediction, I'm going to use that pretty much interchangeably with hypothesis. So, one more time, those are observation, prediction, experimentation, and induction. Let's go through them with an example. The scientist observes some phenomenon in the natural world, makes a prediction or hypothesis about what it is or how it works, designs and conducts an experiment to test the prediction or hypothesis, and applies logical induction to generalize from particulars, to identify patterns in the data, to draw logical conclusions to be reviewed by the scientific community and incorporated into the contemporary body of scientific knowledge if they pass muster. For example, an astronomer observes the movements of a planet, develops a hypothesis that it moves in a circle, not a circle but an ellipse, and makes a concrete testable prediction on that basis, tests his hypothesis by observing a specific place in space at a specific time, and concludes, after repeating an appropriate number of trials, that his model of planetary movement was correct or incorrect. Again, it is crucial to remember that this is not how science actually works, but how science is perceived to work. A rigorous and thorough study of the actual history of science, such as the one published by Kuhn in 1962, does not corroborate that science works in such a neat and orderly way. It doesn't line up with the evidence. But despite that, this is how science in the West has been perceived from at least Francis Bacon in the early 1600s to Karl Popper in the early 1900s. So what makes the scientific method more reliable than everything else? If scientism is the claim that science is our most reliable source of knowledge, then it's the claim that there is something peculiarly reliable about observation, prediction, experimentation, and induction. The question of what makes science reliable when other sources of knowledge aren't, the question of what sets science apart, then becomes the question of what sets apart the scientific method, these 4 steps. I'm going to argue that we regard science as reliable because the 4 steps of the scientific method rely exclusively on sensory perception and logic. Inversely, and more interestingly, the 4 steps of the scientific method rely on nothing outside the self. First, let us consider how this differs from daily human life. At every moment in our daily lives, we are making decisions. And to make these decisions, we need knowledge of the circumstances, but unlike the scientists, we do not rely on only sensory perception and logic. The man facing a conflict between 2 of his coworkers relies on his intuition for the knowledge to decide how to approach the problem. The man giving a loved one some bad news relies on his emotions for the knowledge to decide when to speak and when to be silent. The man hired for his first full-time job, or the man newly married, me, relies on the testimony of his parents and his mentors for the knowledge to decide what to do and what not to do as he opens a new chapter of his life. We are perpetually in need of the knowledge to decide, and we trust the knowledge that comes to us from our intuitions and our emotions and the testimony of others. But a man engaged in science is different. Consider an ecologist in the field. He observes the movements of a pack of wolves, predicts the pack's future movements, devises a plan to observe the predicted movement at the predicted time, and logically derives whatever conclusions he can from the data. During this process, he does not rely on his intuition to tell him things about the wolves, or his emotions, or the testimony of others. Rather, he relies only on sensory perception and logic. In observing the pack and conducting the experiment that tested his prediction, steps 1 and 3 of the scientific method, he relies only on his powers of sight and hearing and touch, his sensory perception. In formulating a prediction and deriving conclusions from the data, steps 2 and 4 of the scientific method, he relies only on his logic, the intellectual power of deriving valid conclusions from a given set of premises. It is not a coincidence that science relies on only these two ways of knowing. There are two things special about sensory perception and logic: universality and objectivity. Sensory perception and logic are universal because they belong to each human person more or less equally. You perceive the world and reason about it. I perceive the world and reason about it. Everyone out there perceives the world and reasons about it. Sensory perception and logic are objective because they always yield the same knowledge in the same circumstances. Anyone looking at a tree will see it as green, and anyone given the same set of premises will derive the same conclusions. There are, of course, exceptions. Consider the blind or the severely mentally ill. But in all but the severest cases, most of their powers of sensory perception, despite these deficiencies, remain intact. Sensory perception and logic remain intact. These two ways of knowing belong to all people in the same way. Intuition and the emotions and the testimony of others are neither universal nor objective to nearly the same degree. Some people possess tremendous powers of intuition. My wife is one. Or exceptionally high emotional intelligence, whereas others possess hardly any. And different people have access to different advice or testimony, so these ways of knowing aren't universal. And intuition and the emotions and even testimony, depending on how it's interpreted and applied, yield very different pieces of knowledge to one man than to his neighbor in the same circumstances. So they are not objective. They do not belong to all people in the same way. But because sensory perception and logic are universal and objective, the knowledge they yield has a very special character. It can always be independently verified. Suppose a man I meet on the street claims that God has revealed new truths to him, or suppose that a scholar presents to me on a topic with which I'm totally unfamiliar, or suppose that my grandfather advises me to value family over everything, in accord with some bit of wisdom that I don't know now and I won't understand until I'm older. In each of these situations, I must choose to accept or reject the knowledge being offered based on my trust or distrust of the person, or my intuitions or my emotions. But I never need to trust the scientist. The claims of the scientist I can always check for myself. He derived his conclusions through his powers of sensory perception and logic. I can check his claims through mine. I may not have access to the Hubble telescope or the Large Hadron Collider, but that's merely a practical difficulty. In principle, I can always independently verify scientific claims. What that means is that science never requires trust. In the history of philosophy, this is commonly referred to as the turn to experience. I accept as true not what I've received from a trustworthy source, but rather what I can, in principle, verify through my own experience, the turn to experience. Especially in the most rigorous and directed form of experience, which is science. The turn to experience historically coincided with a resurgence of skepticism, and this is all happening around the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution in those 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. So we get the turn to experience and this resurgence of skepticism. And because we as human beings are always in need of the knowledge to decide, knowledge to make decisions, we are constantly in the business of distinguishing more reliable sources of knowledge from less reliable ones and deciding whom to trust. But skepticism makes us stingy. It places extremely high demands on any source of knowledge that would be considered reliable, and very few sources pass the test. This brings me at last to what Scientism says about Western culture. It reveals our skepticism. I would argue that we adored science before it proved its mettle, because we were skeptical, as much then as we are now, if not more. We trust the scientist when we trust no one else, because we can, in principle, verify or falsify his claims for ourselves. Scientism, by way of skepticism, reveals our fundamental distrust of sources outside the self. Our fundamental inability to turn pages. This raises the question, why should we distrust sources outside the self? There's only one reason to distrust a source of knowledge, and it is unreliability. We distrust a source of knowledge if and only if the knowledge that it offers to us cannot be relied upon, if it is just as likely false as true. So why do we believe sources of knowledge outside the self are unreliable? Up to this point, I have taken an analytical, philosophical approach to science and scientism, but this question is more of a historical one. It is a commonplace among historians that modernity, the period referring to Western society from roughly 1500 to the present, has been defined by the rejection of authority and tradition. But the question remains, why? How did we as a society change our views about the individual self and come to distrust sources outside the self? For this question, I must admit, I have more questions than answers. I'm not a graduate student, and I don't have a graduate degree. I'm just an independent enthusiast. And with what comparatively small knowledge I have of philosophy, I have even less of history. Thus, I want to explore this topic by giving you the undergraduate crash course version of some things about the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution, and then sharing with you all the questions that I have myself. So, since we're looking at historically, we're taking a historical approach. The question is kind of when. When did this come up? When did we come to distrust sources outside the self? Some historians argue it began with the Renaissance in the 1300s and 1400s in a very inchoate form, when the West rediscovered classical art and literature. Greek and Roman art and literature were always studied in the West after the fall of the Roman Empire, but primarily for their form, not their content. Scholars studied Greek and Latin texts to learn Greek and Latin in order to better understand Scripture and ultimately God. When they did read the text for their content, it was to learn what the Greeks and Romans had to say about philosophy and theology, not to emulate their art, literature, or culture. Remember, this is the Middle Ages, this is Christendom, and classical texts, even if they are the cornerstone of Western civilization, are pagan. But in the 1300s, a movement began in Europe to study classical art and culture, not only for its languages and philosophy, but also for what the ancients had to say about the human condition through art, literature, and culture. And this movement was the Renaissance. The Renaissance, following classical culture, was about the inherent goodness of man, his intellectual capability, and the dignity of the individual. In general, Renaissance thinkers focused intently on the individual, the self. And each of these three historical periods I'm going to try to connect to the individual or the self. Other historians argue that modern skepticism began with the Reformation. The Reformation began in 1517 when a Catholic priest named Martin Luther, who, like many in that era, was fed up with the corruption of the church in those days, became a heretic by nailing his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. And he would have been persecuted as a heretic were it not for a few important factors. The Catholic Church, perhaps complacent or overconfident after its long unchallenged dominion over Europe, responded oddly slowly to Luther's heresy, giving him and his followers the time to develop and disseminate their ideas. The recently invented printing press spread his ideas in the form of pamphlets across Europe like wildfire, and the rising rates of literacy enabled people to read them. The church had grown corrupt before and during the Great Schism in the late 1300s and early 1400s, and the popes after that time did less to root out the corruption and more to reestablish the church's dominion. Mistake. So kings and subjects alike came to doubt the church's moral authority and resent the church's hierarchy. Luther's critiques catalyzed both kings and their subjects for perhaps the first time ever to work together, so they combined their efforts to cast off the heavy yoke of the Catholic Church. This could be called the first large-scale grassroots movement, and it helped to usher in the age of democracy and the age of the individual itself. Yet other historians argue that modern skepticism began with the scientific revolution. During the scientific revolution, which began with Copernicus in 1543, but really took off in the 1600s with Galileo, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, was a period of questioning received views about the natural world. The Middle Ages had developed a rigorous, complex, and systematic philosophy and theology, but not a systematic science. Contrary to popular belief, much scientific progress was made in the Middle Ages, many discoveries, but science was not systematized or particularly focused on because medieval scholars studied the natural world in order to understand God. Science was always a means. It was actually called the Ancilla Theologiae, or the handmaiden of theology. But especially after the writings of Newton, there arose a belief that the natural world operated mechanistically according to a set of natural laws that could be discovered through experimentation and observation, which made the world not mysterious and awesome, but rational and controllable. But most important was not their goal or their ideological change, but their method. Medieval scientists began with established theories and ideas, some of which dated back almost 2,000 years to Aristotle, and sought to construct new theories that fit with the tradition, the things that they had received. But the new scientists in the 1600s discovered major flaws in the science that they had received from tradition, especially astronomy. So they ignored it and began anew by observing the natural world with new technologies like the telescope. They struck it out on their own and gathered data for themselves. So whereas medieval science began with tradition, modern science began with the observations of the individual. And the great success of the new scientific method clarified and strengthened the individualism that began with the Renaissance. So it was modern skepticism, which trusts only the individual self, born during the Renaissance or the Reformation or the Scientific Revolution or some other period of history, or all of them, probably all of them. These are questions which I have neither the time nor the expertise to answer, but I'd love to discuss. Oh, I never clicked that one. How do you guys know what I was talking about? So, now I want to turn back to scientism itself. And there's something peculiar about the new scientists, particularly their ideological leader, who's Francis Bacon. The new scientists often repeated that our experiences are misleading or deceptive, and that we must found our ideas about reality on our mathematical models, not our experiences. This is a key tenet of scientism and skepticism, that our minds are prone to error. This is especially clear when reading Bacon, who, appalled by the falsehood of some contemporary ideas that they had received from tradition, entirely dismissed testimony, the testimony of others, as a source of knowledge. And he even dismissed individual experience, except in a rigorous and directed context of the scientific method. The skepticism proselytized by Bacon intensified after Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man, his most influential book after The Origin of Species, in which he argued that human minds evolved from the minds of monkeys. For many, that was an even more pointed vote of no confidence in knowledge derived from human experience. It is easy to see how this view justifies skepticism. If the human mind is, in words of contemporary scholar Steven Pinker, prone to illusions, fallacies, and superstitions, is there any source of knowledge in others or in ourselves that we shouldn't doubt? So we have discussed the philosophy and we've touched on the history in order to better understand the culture in which we live, but my ultimate goal in critiquing society and culture is always to enrich our concrete, practical, everyday lives. So how does skepticism, or more specifically scientism, affect our everyday lives? It determines our relations to ideas. That is a wild thought. It determines our relations to ideas. So, if someone confronts you with a scientific belief, you have to accept it. If they can justify to you that that belief is in fact scientific based on their definition, and you reject it, you will be considered stupid, ignorant, naive, irresponsible, or malicious. But forcing people to accept science isn't that bad. I think much worse is that if somebody confronts you with a non-scientific belief, you don't have to give him the time of day. You can reject a non-scientific belief at any time for any reason. Scientism reserves for us what I call the right to reject. This becomes a major problem only when we remind ourselves what beliefs are scientific. So, I want to look at this as what beliefs are always considered scientific, sometimes considered scientific, and never considered scientific. Always includes physics, chemistry, biology, geology, and astronomy. These aren't exhaustive lists, by the way. We sometimes consider scientific ideas coming from, or knowledge coming from psychology, sociology, anthropology, medicine, and nutrition. And we never, this is the kicker, we never consider scientific ideas coming from philosophy, theology, art, literature, practical wisdom, lived experience, or the testimony of others. Just briefly reflect on your own life. Like, out of your knowledge, how much do you know directly through physics, chemistry, biology, geology, astronomy? How much do you know from things in the never category? So, all of those things that, I'll just speak for myself, all of those things that I have learned from philosophy, theology, art, literature, practical wisdom, lived experience, and the testimony of others can be rejected by anyone, at any time, for any reason. And I would argue that every single person in this room has, in some way and to some extent, suffered from that attitude. Scientism, so in conclusion, scientism is a bad way to live. Skepticism is a bad way to live. It fosters, this is why I care about this. It fosters a contempt for others and their lived experiences, especially when they conflict with our prior beliefs. Think about that. It fosters a contempt for others and their lived experiences, especially when they conflict with our prior beliefs. It justifies living in an echo chamber, and it arrogates to us the right to reject any non-scientific belief that for some reason we don't like and would rather ignore. It fosters a pride that harms human relationships and separates us from other people, and that is my answer to the question of why scientism matters.
So we don't get the review page?
No, I was going to leave this up during the discussion.
Okay.
Or I can take it down if it will distract from Dr. McConnell's.
No, leave it up.
Okay.
Okay. It is our frequent practice at the Socratic Club to ask a commentator to comment on drought issues, on a presentation, and help spur conversation. For our commentator today, we have Dr. Paul De Palma, who is a professor of computer science and I think an eminent humanist on the faculty of Gonzaga University. So he kind of straddles the issues that are raised by Corwin's talk. So, Dr. De Palma.
Should I come up?
If you want to, please do, Jack.
Corwin, you know so much stuff.
Great course.
Well, it's easy to talk about science to non-scientists, but I have a couple of real scientists here. Well, I thought that was very interesting, this point that you made, and I last night when I was reading your paper about science and the self, because there is this thing that has been troubling me recently, which is really wildly off the topic, but I can't help saying why it appears that people really don't value privacy very much these days, despite what you read in the New York Times. And the conclusion that I've reached after some study is this notion of the self, this interior space here that's private, that you reveal only grudgingly in certain intimate moments, is it's historically contingent, and it blasted off about the same time the scientific revolution blasted off. So I have to put these two things together. I have been thinking about literacy, print, and other kinds of things, but science, how interesting is that? It is interesting that you talked about the scientific revolution and gathering new data, but, and I have to defer to my physicist here about this, but it is my understanding that now Copernicus predates Galileo by 125 years, something like that, I think, 150 years. And Copernicus didn't gather data. He reconceptualized this thing. So I'm arguing with you a little bit, but I want to argue with you really strongly about something. There is this idea, I love this, you use that word, adore science. I have a friend who's quite a successful politician. You should vote for her, Lisa Brown. She says, she has, so I attribute this to her, she says to me that an economy is a moral document. It tells us what as a people we value. So I want to ask you what we value from the federal budget. Approximately 60% of the last go-round of the federal budget went to Social Security and Medicare. As we value the elderly, because they vote, I imagine. 20% went to the military. Now that's the next largest category, which is a bit surprising. How much do you think went to science? 1%. Less than what went to transportation, less than what went to public housing. If we adore science, save me from that kind of adoration. And as it happens, public universities who field Division I sports teams spend more money on their athletic budgets than they do on education. I was going to come in here, but I don't have this data, but I would be willing to go right on a limb and suggest that Gonzaga spends not just more, but considerably more on the athletic budget than it does on its science labs. Adoration? I don't know. In 2010, the last time I could find data, 69% of PhDs in physics were unemployed. A starting biologist, BS in biology, earns $46,000 a year. That's a reasonable salary, but they're not getting rich. The highest paid faculty at GU or in law and business. A finance professor makes onwards of 50% more than a physics professor. So that's not adoration either. So I wonder about the overreach of science, but I don't see it reflected in the way we spend our money. I want to tell you about this. No, I think I've talked enough.
No, if you have more comments,
I have a ton of comments. But I think it's time to stop. This is not my day. This is yours. Okay.
Thank you.
So should we leap into discussion now, or should we?
Yes, we should. We should.
Cool. Dr. Corwin, do you want to sit over here?
Sure.
You'd be honored with a chair.
You can be our panel. And we'll let you guys field questions as you wish. So, questions, comments?
Are you guys blinded by the light? Probably turn off this.
I'm shorter than it.
Oh,
So, no, I'm good. If you're not blinded by the light.
No, I'm not blind. Okay.
Thanks. Okay.
You specifically link adoration to our budget and where we spend our money. I adore books. I don't adore paying rent. but that's where most of my money goes to. So I'm not sure that adoration and how it conflicts with needs really actually accurately reflects what we want to spend our money on and what we have to spend our money on.
Well, what if we are, okay, I get that, that's nice. But if we're so infatuated with science, we as a culture, why don't we spend more money on it? So the chance of having an NSF grant funded is about 1 in 5. Chances of having an NSF grant funded from Gonzaga is considerably less than that.
But wouldn't the proper comparison to be the chances of getting an art project funded versus an NSF project? And where that is versus the military or social programs? Because his distinction was between disciplines rather than
Lower,
just what we do in our
even
lives,
lower
right?
on our value scale here at Gonzaga is the music professor who's the lowest paid.
But wouldn't that be an argument that supports
Yeah,
him then
I agree,
using?
I agree.
I think that was a really good point, because frankly, I think budgets are a fantastic way to evaluate values on not only the institutional, but the individual level. I mean, that's what I try to do. I look at my own budget to figure out what I value. And I think you make a really good point. I think the modern Western society adores science. That opening comment is it's actually a lot more true of people a few hundred years ago. The founding fathers, Immanuel Kant, Hume, Voltaire, the Enlightenment, the 1700s was really like, I think, the pinnacle of the way that those people talk about science, and more generally talk about things that we know for ourselves. Like, it's dare to think for yourself is like the battle cry of the Enlightenment. They have such high praise for ideas that you develop and sort of articulate by yourself, and such just dripping contempt for ideas that you receive from your parents or society or tradition or any of those things. And I think that was the high point in regards to science and reason, the idolization of science and reason. But I would say that today we've moved on from that, partially because it failed us in some important ways. Something that I would really like to study is how cynicism erupted after the 19th century, because there's during the 20th century, because the 19th century, we think the world's on up and up. There's the Industrial Revolution, there's like capitalist societies, there's religious freedom, there's all these new things that look great. And then in the 20th century, we get World War I and the Great Depression and World War II and the Holocaust and communism and the Cold War and Stalin and Pol Pot and the Vietnam War and the Korean War and the Gulf War and then, let's see, is that enough? So something, I think that there was in the Enlightenment and really the 19th century, I think we adored science. That kind of peaked and went away after we saw some of the fruits of that trajectory. I would argue that today, we don't idolize science. I mean, you just look at like how, in certain circles, how culturally acceptable it is to reject evolution, the Big Bang, and climate change, for which there's so much evidence. And instead, I think we moved from scientism to just brute skepticism. Like, we reject whatever we feel like rejecting. And part of that, I think, is the discovery that science is actually an institution. Like, it relies on people as much as other things. But I think you made a really good point that it's important to recognize that we don't idolize science. And so, but I still think we have this vague cloud of skepticism that grew through scientism, but now overshadows it. Oh man.
I think we need to break down the we. During the Enlightenment, virtually everyone was not educated and didn't believe in science, right? So if you're talking about who the voters are, right? I mean, that's what defines the funding. If you were to poll people in the academy, I think you'd get a lot more support for science. And I think Corwin is really concerned about what the intellectual elite think about science, rather than what John Q. Public thinks about science, right? And with the intellectual elite, religion is not a very popular view, right? Something like 90% of biologists who won Nobel Prizes don't practice religion, don't believe in religion. It's down to 50% when you get to physicists. But, and the argument is that physicists have a much more vivid sense of what they're doing is theoretical rather than simply reading off the facts. Whereas biologists, there isn't as much theoretical disagreement on basic fundamental principles. And so it's easier to think that, we're just giving you the facts. Like about DNA, that's a fact. People talk about evolution as a fact rather than a theory, right? Quantum mechanics, is that a fact or is that a theory? Yeah, see? But I think it's really a function of I think it's more a function of the academy than it is a function of American society overall.
That is a mistake that you would make from not being very historically educated.
Well, it's who you're talking to. You're talking about the people you talk to.
Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair. Matthew?
So, scientism holds, earlier on you talked about how scientism gives the right to reject, right? The scientist, or the person who practices scientism.
Scientist.
Right, sure. They still need to argue their case, though. Because the person who practices in scientism says, your practical experience, your testimony, I reject it out of hand, science only. But what interests me is how does the scientist, I don't like that, how do they interact with the person who doesn't practice scientism? Because at the risk of straying too close to politics, you have individuals, Michael Gove from Brexit, who famously said, we're tired of experts. We don't care what the numbers and the statistics say, we're tired of experts. You have Newt Gingrich saying people feel like murder by gun is on the rise. Who cares what the numbers are? People are afraid, they feel this way. So how does the person who practices scientism, they reject the person's feelings of fear out of hand. How do they argue their case to the person who's the opposite of the scientist? How do those two doctrines interact?
In my experience, contempt. They don't. They're just like people who accept non-scientific beliefs are stupid. I mean, and I drew that like.
Give us concrete examples.
I drew that. Okay, part of my problem was that for my thesis, I read a lot of the new atheists and who, in large part, talk about things they don't know and have like a really fiery, one-sided view of things. They're much more intellectually and philosophically sophisticated atheists who are not the new atheists. People know who I mean when I'm talking about the new atheists. Okay, it's Richard Dawkins. He's like he epitomizes them. And in my experience, the people that I've met who embrace scientism and the intellectuals that I've read who embrace scientism don't know. It's just like people who accept non-scientific beliefs, especially in the public realm, and try to impose them on others, are just dumb. That's, I mean, oh man. Richard Dawkins one time gave a talk where he exhorted his audience to mock Christians publicly. He told them, he was talking about Catholics specifically, and he was saying, you believe that bread and wine turn into like transubstantiate, they change into something ontologically different. And he said this, the only response to that view is mockery. Public mockery. You shame them out of believing it because they're so irrational that no form of argumentation can work.
So that might be practically how they currently interact. Is there any hope of a reconciliation or meaningful dialogue?
I think only it's hard when you talk to anyone who differs. Okay, I mean, in my experience, when the only way to talk to somebody who fundamentally differs with you is to talk about fundamentals. You can't like, you know, somebody who, I'm Catholic. That wasn't clear. Somebody who believes in materialism to their core, and somebody who believes in theism to their core, which I would if I were a better Catholic, then the only thing they can really talk about is they differ. I would argue that they differ so fundamentally that the only thing they can talk about is the fundamentals themselves. And so I think conversations like this, where you pick up scientism and really just like dig through it to say like, what are the assumptions here? What are the what are the assumptions? And then let's look at the base assumptions themselves and have a conversation about those.
I admire that, but I don't think that's the most pragmatic way to discuss with people you disagree with.
Yeah.
I think it's, I mean, couldn't it be more effective to identify where the atheist and the theist agree for very different reasons? They don't agree on the reasons, but they agree on the conclusions, so that we could coordinate our behavior, even if we don't agree on our motivations. And could that, in time, lead to a problematization of the assumptions that the other side is acting out of ill will? You know? Like, for example, to Dawkins' comment that somebody who believes in transubstantiation, you know, there's just no talking to him. Well, maybe the response is, well, Dawkins, if you understand transubstantiation in a way that makes it incomprehensible, maybe you don't understand transubstantiation. I mean, isn't that the measure of understanding something? Is that you can understand how why somebody might believe it? If you can't understand why somebody might believe something, maybe you don't understand it.
I was 2 or 3 years, I think I remember talking to him about this when I was reading the Dawkins book. So he says that religion, Catholicism, makes claims about the world. And as claims about the world, they're subject to falsification. And you wouldn't accept that?
No,
I wouldn't accept it. I don't think.
Yes, you did, but I told you.
I can't.
But I don't know if Corwin is. I don't know if I really totally poisoned Corwin. The religion isn't about facts.
I think you
about
effectively
values.
poisoned my mind. I can't think of one. And that is, I did explore that in my thesis. Oh gosh, I had some stupid name for it. Methodological constraint.
Well, Dawkins gives examples like the resurrection. Here it is almost Easter now. And so he would say the idea of people coming to life from the dead, that's so absurd. And that's clearly the gospel claim, according to St. Paul anyway, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, is about, is a claim about history. And it radically alters the nature of history.
But they wouldn't claim that. But they wouldn't claim that they have historical evidence for it.
No, but
So it's not a historical
the description
claim.
is enough. For Dawkins, the description is enough. Resurrection isn't a physical possibility, and so he throws it out of hand. This is just simple superstition, historical superstition.
But even a true believing, I mean, even a diehard Orthodox Christian, like myself, for example, when I say Jesus really rose from the dead, right? What am I saying? What kind of a claim am I making? I'm not making a repeatable claim. I'm not making a claim. I'm not making a claim that I've got sufficient scientific evidence to convince a fair-minded person. I claim it as an article of faith. I'm claiming it makes my life salvific. It makes my life worthwhile. Right?
Well, I think.
I mean, what else am I claiming? Am I claiming that if we had TV cameras back there, they'd pick something up? Is that what I'm claiming? Is that what I have to claim to be Orthodox? That it has to be scientifically verifiable, otherwise it doesn't count? It seems to me that's scientism invading religion at that point.
It's I think one of the ways that one of the things that, well, okay, there's a couple different things that's going on. I'm not sure which one to respond to. So one is the claim that miracles are impossible because miracles have not been observed. That's interesting.
Well, I would say the response to scientism isn't that religion is a science after all. That's not the response. Because that's getting into scientism, right? That's saying, of course science is a religion, otherwise I wouldn't take it seriously. It's like, oh, so you're a scientist too?
Yeah, yeah. Which is interesting, and I think that's the unproductive. I guess that's what I was trying to get at. If you accept scientism and then banter with a scientist, you're going to lose. Because you're right, at root you're accepting that science.
You're only
is
going
the
to
only
use.
value.
You're only going to lose if you accept their field of battle.
Well, yeah, like you said, you're right. Religion must be a science because science is the only worthwhile pursuit. So you have to get away from that idea of science is the only worthwhile pursuit. Which I think, Father Clancy, what you mentioned about talking about areas of agreement, I think that gets into pragmatism, just like pragmatic concerns of talking to other people and working with other people in this objective external world in which we exist, where we have to do things regardless of our ideas and some of our intellectual commitments. I think that gets into a lot more of the complexity of human life. And if we were to take like a rigorous, logical view of discussion and argumentation, then the only way to have conversations between Orthodox Christians and scientists is to talk about, go to the fundamentals and go to the root, because you can't practice foundationalism and logical deduction and derivation unless you do that. But like you were saying, I thought an implication of your comment was we don't always have to approach something in a strictly logical manner, like a computer. And so I think that I really appreciate that comment of like, what do we practically do? I don't think it's because I've tried this in my life before, and it doesn't always work to just try to go down to the fundamentals. But then when it does, I think, comes to like living with other people, working with other people, and then when you your activities rub up against one another, and you expose areas like, wait, what do you really think about religion? What do you really think about science? Like, do you think that miracles are impossible because they've never been observed? And then like, what exactly do I mean when I say that Jesus rose from the dead? Am I making verifiable claims that have focus, etc., etc.? So that is yes, yeah, sorry.
I was just gonna say, going back to what does the resurrection really mean? I don't know if I like because if you just say, well, we're not talking about science, now you're getting the dualism thing going on and saying, well, we're just talking about metaphor. Scripture doesn't actually mean what it says, right? So I think it's not so much of
Well,
saying.
it means what it says.
Right.
The question is, what is it saying?
Right, but I think there is something to, if there were movie cameras back then, it would pick up something, right?
I
Because
don't know.
otherwise.
You think that's implied?
I think so. I don't know, I think a lot of Christians would say they think so.
Do you need to have a soul? Do
But
you
you
need
don't-
to have a camera that can see that too?
Well, I guess that gets back to the verifiable. So I guess the Christian thinks it's not important to verify necessarily, but they should coincide. It shouldn't just, maybe I misunderstood, but I feel like it should, like going back to the science as a handmaid of theology, or like the relationship between scripture and tradition is that they should go together, right? So that going back to a more classical, because I think it's a little bit of an easy sidestep to say it's just a metaphor. And maybe the best way to get back to that is, again, going back to relational or common. But I don't know, I don't know, there is something about.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just a metaphor if you think just a metaphor is so trivial. I think it's, I've dedicated my life to it, so I don't think it's trivial.
Right. I think even material is important.
And it's a historical fact. It would be a historical fact, not a.
It's not historically verifiable,
Well,
so what does it mean to say it's an historical fact?
So is this getting us a little bit away from the subject just slightly?
Well, what I think it's not doing, what it's doing is it's showing the pull of scientism. That honest to God, religion wants to be science. And it's really hard for religion to resist the pull of needing to be scientific if it's going to be respectable.
You see that with history to some extent. There are people who try to scientize history and scientize psychology and sociology, which are scientism. They're very experimental in some ways, but very not experimental in others. And that's kind of a separate topic that I think arises because of scientism, is the battle over what is and isn't science. And you can see that with just about every discipline. And I think you're right that if we try to fight that fight to make religion a science, then we're just saying, yeah, science is the only valuable thing.
So,
Do you have a direct response?
all right, pardon? Okay, so it seems to me that the presentation on scientism is very much motivated on the idea that scientism is a worldview that is making claims about its explanatory power to give us an explanation for what is, for the reality of life and for all that is, and that anyone who is a believer of any sort is certainly not putting science in the be-all and end-all and giving it the greatest explanatory power. Given that science has its ability to explain a great number of phenomenon, we are not, if you and I are believers, we are not according science as much room as explaining everything. We're saying, yeah, it explains some things, it doesn't explain everything else. It's an epistemological idea, what explains the universe. So the foundation of scientism is a way of explaining that the Christian or someone who believes in religion is willing to accommodate to a point, but not willing to say, I'm going the full distance and I'm going to put all my eggs in that basket, this particular basket. I hope the world is to be explained. It seems to me that the controversy is over the explanatory power of science. Does it explain everything that is out there? And if we answer no, then the scientism fails.
I think that goes back to your first statement saying, whatever slide it was, that science is explanatory. There's certainly a large number of scientists, especially physicists, who would not take that. They would say we're actually not explaining anything. We're not doing metaphysics. We're not talking about reality. What we're doing is we're getting really good at making predictions. And that, I think, is something that all definitions of science share, is this idea of prediction. And so if you disagree with what reality is, I don't really care, right? If I have a scientific model that involves gnomes with magnets and I get the position of Mars right, I'm going to use it. It doesn't matter that you say, well, gnomes don't exist. I don't care, right? I don't have a sense in which I would argue that electrons exist, right? A lot of physicists say, I don't think electrons exist, but if I talk about them as things, I can tell you what my meter's going to read, and I can make your iPhone work right, things like this. And so the predictive part is in there. And I think that's actually an interesting parallel here, because if I think about prediction, and I think about self versus others, I think a similarity here with self is I am really good at predicting me, but other people constantly amaze me by what they do, right? Even people that are close to me, I find them to be annoyingly unpredictable in what they do. And I'm okay with it, but I wonder about some kind of psychological parallel here in this idea of self with, people like Dawkins, why there is such, arrogance and borderline hubris on this idea. It's because they do know themselves, don't they? And they parallel, I wonder if they're paralleling that to what they think about science and how science should act in its predictions, right? And then everybody else is like, you know, oh my God. Everybody, because if you follow this parallel, aren't the others, I mean, psychologically, others are also the other fields, right? Aren't they also art and philosophy? And I'm like, oh my God, they're such a mess. Like, who knows what the hell they're going to do?
They wish they were scientists. But
Yeah, well, no, well, I don't know.
I mean, I think that might be what the scientists.
But I don't know what the other, I mean, you know. But I think the predictive thing is more important, and I think this is where the new atheists you talk about fail so miserably, is they treat science as doing more than explanatory. My understanding of them is they treat science as doing metaphysics.
Yeah,
It's explaining the way the world is, not the way the world behaves, which is much different.
I think that's, there are two really important points to make. First was the prediction thing, and it is, when I said that the view of science that I presented was idealized, that's one of the, maybe the most important way in which it is idealized, because a lot of people hold that view, that science makes predictions. We don't make metaphysical claims or ontological claims about what exists or what doesn't. In the history of chemistry, a lot of things were explained in terms of phlogistons, which were like these little, like, pipe thing. I can't remember all the details of like what a phlogiston is. Do you read Dr. Calvin?
It isn't important.
Okay, it's like they're like atoms. They're like they're a compositional unit, and they successfully explained a lot of thermodynamics. And now we look back on it like that's idiotic. How could you think that there were little tubes? And now we think there are little strings, and so it's. But that's a crucial idea, that science makes predictions. And you could argue that the goal of science is not to explain the world, but to control the world, and I actually would. But the second thing you said was the sort of parallel between an attitude of sort of the unpredictability of otherness, and how that manifests in not just like scientism and with science and other disciplines, but also myself. Others, and that's a really good point as well.
Eric, I think you're being too modest to the conditions of science. Maybe that's what a working
No,
scientist.
I don't.
Well, a working scientist really is quite interested in predictions in exactly the way you say. But when they get old, they start speculating. The title of E.O. Wilson's current book is The Meaning of Life. I think it can't get much larger than that.
But you gave examples of that. And Stephen Hawking was
Yes,
one that
another.
did. It's
They
just
all
simply
do it when they get old. You gotta get old
ridiculous.
first.
But people like that, you have to question. I think their popularity is a symptom of scientism in the last century. Physicists that read things by Hawking's go, gee, Steve, pull it back. You know, you don't know philosophy from a hole in the ground. You should keep your mouth shut, right? It's real physicists. Most physicists I know do not agree with Hawking's and Dawkins and the other. They're like, no. I don't know anything about the way the world is, but I can tell you what this meter's going to read, and I can tell you what Mars is going to be observed in the sky. I can do that, but what these are, you know, there's, I mean, it's a dangerous word to use in a philosophy conversation, but scientific truth isn't ultimate truth. Scientific truth means the predictions match the data. And then if I do that, I go, well, I'm doing a great job. And then that's the only measurement in the end. And that's what science does in the end, is the experimentation is so I have some data to match to my predictions. And if they match, I get to publish my paper. If they don't, well, you know, I'll try something else.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point. This gentleman has had his hand up for a long time.
I was just gonna say that I think one of the things that you were driving at in your talk was that that part of the problem that scientism is causing in academia and other parts of the world is a symptom of something that's going on throughout our culture, and that's the collapse of dialogue. And when Dawkins says just mock them, that's the end of dialogue. We're seeing the end of dialogue everywhere, and that's why I'm very happy to be here and see some dialogue going on. But scientism, I think, is kind of an end of dialogue. It wants to say, no, there's no other way to talk about this. And so then how do you explain the miracle of information as opposed to static? And you get into, you have a lot of problems because you can't, there are things that you can't put a meter on.
Do you?
I do, absolutely.
Really? That's a pretty strong statement. I
That is-
think it's a metaphysical statement, actually.
It is, I agree,
Well,
think it is.
It is, but it's true. There are things you can't put a meter on. Like, okay, so the self. What is the self?
Psychologists are beavering away.
They're working it.
They're working so hard at it.
You got the reductionists, the anti-reductionists, and.
Yeah, I know that, but it's still not. There's no place to put the meter on.
The undeniable fact is there are things that we can't put a meter on yet, and it's the two camps of how do you explain that fact? Is it because it is in principle impossible or in practice very difficult?
And then we have the scientific speed of light, which is a constant, and now we know it's not.
Okay.
It's true.
What?
Father Clancy.
I didn't get that.
You didn't see the email about the speed of light?
No.
No, I haven't heard that. I didn't.
Yeah,
Relax.
it isn't a constant.
That's interesting.
You can do the research,
Well, I think that is
But it
a
doesn't vary too much.
but it's not.
It's not constant. It doesn't vary all over the map.
It's an illusion.
it's too much. I wanted to bring it back briefly to, I think the conversation about science is fascinating, what science is, what science does, and how, like, all the things that break this, the oversimplified concept of science, but that is the reason that, what's your name, sir?
Rob Joyce.
What Rob brought up is the reason I'm interested in this, because I think, like we hit on at the very beginning, I think we moved through scientism, which is all about science and the nature of science and who does science and how does science work. I think we moved through scientism into what I call petty skepticism, which is, it is perfectly socially acceptable to reject a non-scientific belief with no justification. No. Like, you could, because, for example, I'll like walk into a room and some, like, I say I recently converted to Catholicism. I think it's true. And one of my friends who's an ex-Catholic would say, like, I recently departed from Catholicism. I think it's not. And we dismiss that as a difference of opinion, despite the enormous practical difference that makes in my life. And we see it in the political sphere as well, of like people thinking you believe that because you're stupid, and I believe what I believe because I'm smart. And that, I think, is that right to reject without justification any belief that we don't honor as scientific. It leads to a breakdown of society to a greater or lesser extent, and that's what I'm really concerned about.
You ought to have evidence for this, so I don't think you have to engage in the scientific method, but don't you require evidence?
Yeah, but I think evidence can come in the fight.
No,
Well,
this idea that if it isn't based on evidence,
No,
it's not rational,
I
that's
think that
bullshit.
I think it is.
I think I'm a scientist.
No, it's just
No.
that your imagination needs to be more capacious.
It's taking a permissive view of evidence. I think lived experience is evidence, which itself entails some presuppositions. Like, for some reason that if my lived experience confirms something, then there's some reason that would count as that would give me the metaphysics of, like, if my lived experience confirms, say, like a doctrine of the faith, then that's evidence that the doctrine of the faith is true. That itself entails, it's got some presuppositions.
So we're always
associated
getting
with it.
back to what
But-
validates truth.
Yeah.
And how we validate truth.
And that is the fundamental question. In
That is
scientism,
the
it's
fundamental
science
question.
As if we know what truth is.
Well, we're gonna argue about it no matter what, even if we can't agree on the definition.
Dr. Mapu,
Yeah, I just wanted, just in the interest of typology here, I wanted to clarify, it does seem to me we have three positions on the table. There's scientism, there's Father Clancy's view, which is religion is not scientific, which means it isn't evidential, and you just articulated another view, which is not all appeal to evidence is science, right? I think it's really important to understand we've got a range of views on the table here. So it's possible to talk about, I think one of the ways, one of the insidious effects of scientism in our culture, and you see this in, for example, Stephen Jay Gould's famous non-overlapping magisteria, that the only appeal to evidence is scientific, and any other appeal is going to be non-rational, non-evidential, non-scientific. Well, that's, you use the word dualism, I would say there's a dichotomy here in that way of looking at things, and it's a radical, unhelpful dichotomy. I myself would say we should talk about evidence for the resurrection. I know that's not Father Clancy's view.
Well,
But,
I can revise what I said once you get done.
Okay, all right, well, no, I'll stop here. Go ahead.
I shouldn't have used the TV analogy. My claim is, my belief in the resurrection isn't based on evidence. It's based on, it's a commitment by which I live my life. It's not because somebody has convinced me that historically it's more likely than not that the apostles claimed that Jesus rose from the dead was based on empirical evidence. I mean, that's not why I believe in the resurrection. And first of all, I believe in the resurrection. Whether the resurrection happened is a different question, it seems to me. Whether it's a historical fact is a different question. So I don't know the fact. I don't know whether it's a fact that he rose from the dead. But my religion doesn't depend on that fact. Because
You wouldn't accept that kind of argument in any other religion, would you?
what? Of course I would.
You would?
You like me? That's not based on evidence. It's based on the fact that I want to have a relationship with you.
I mean, I could make some wild assertion about what's going on in Eric right now, and you would have to believe me because I just asserted it to be so.
No. I
That's
believe
my belief.
it's a belief. It's not a belief that, it's a belief in.
Okay.
I have faith in the resurrection. I have faith in a life governed by the resurrection. I don't have faith in the life governed by, turtles and herring.
Do you say that in the same way that I would say I'm a socialist?
Yeah.
There's certain things I hold about
Right.
the world, and
Well, I think a better one would be you
It's
have a...
it's closer.
You have a
It's closer
relation,
now.
you have a loving relationship with your daughter. You don't understand that in a scientific way at all, but you hold it as a truth of the world, but you never investigated that for evidence scientifically.
Yeah, if you treat your wife
But
like
you
a
take it as
scientific lab
you take it as
experiment,
a
you're
truth
gonna
of
lose
the
it.
world, that you love your daughter. Well, why, Paul? You have no scientific evidence for that at all.
oh, I assume that comes with species membership. I'm sorry that you left. I mean, that's something I have no control. I would be,
Well, no, my point isn't that, I'm not looking for an explanation, I'm saying you still hold it.
yes.
I think part of it that we hadn't brought up is I'll explain that. Of this
Let me just, Corwin, let me just mention, it is 5:30, we're technically at the end time, but because of my lateness, we got started late, so I'm perfectly willing to sit here for another 10 minutes or so and continue the conversation. So those of you who need to leave, feel free to, but we'll continue the conversation for a bit here.
Yeah.
And you were saying, Corwin, go ahead.
At first I thought you said you are staying, and I was like, oh, I just...
You must stay.
Like, I wasn't trying to leave. No, I think scientism is interesting because one of the problems that we haven't touched on is there's a problem that all of us have to deal with, whether we accept scientism or not. There's an enormous amount of things. There's an enormous number of things that we believe not on the basis of scientific evidence, and everyone has to address that problem or concern. Like, why? Whether if I'm not a scientist, then it's fine. It's like I believe there are other forms of epistemological justification besides science, and I believe some things on the basis of science, almost all of which I actually believe on the basis of testimony, because I haven't done the experiments. And so there's some things I base on science, and then there are other things that I justify, other beliefs that I justify through some other means. If you're a scientist, it's a harder problem because, like you said, like I'm a socialist. I believe that these things will lead to a society that enables human flourishing, or however you define, why you would be a socialist. And so, cool. And so, I think there's that problem that whether or not we accept scientism, everybody has to give an answer to that question. And so, if you have a more expansive view of justification, like beliefs are allowed to be justified in ways besides science, it's not a problem. But under scientism, it is a problem. I just wanted to say, I mean, that's kind of what everybody was already acknowledging, but I wanted to say it a little bit more explicitly. So.
I think it's actually just helpful to know about the phenomena of this in our culture because, it hasn't always been this way, and it certainly could be addressed, especially with, as knowledge becomes more and more superficial, the deeper thinkers will see the fallacy of it perhaps down the road, especially if we continue to have dialogue like this. Maybe there will be more thoughtful conversation as it continues to be more of a phenomenon and people get sick of it.
Yeah.
I mean, because if it isn't true, then it's going to fall apart. It can only remain a phenomenon for so long, I would think, unless people don't think, which maybe they might not. But, if we continue to use philosophy, theology, and the other things that are perhaps our other, epistemological ways of verification, then maybe we will be able to, not shoot down, but perhaps withstand mockery of those who prefer not to think. And, it's easier to mock than to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's history is the test of an idea. If there's an idea that every time you try to practically implement, it just grinds to a halt, then it won't stick around. And you could argue that life is pragmatism and we can't do anything about truth, and some people do argue that on that basis. But that's definitely a fact. It's like if an idea isn't workable, it won't stick around.
And love wins out. He's right, you can't treat your wife like a science experiment or a lab project.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you think there are people who are, this is kind of following on Sisters, bringing us back to your thesis, do you think there are people who are unwittingly or unconsciously committed to scientism? And if, I was going to say if there are, so that's like the warm-up question, and if there are such people, it seems to me that what you're interested in is a project of anti-scientistic evangelization.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, it is.
Well, so how do you evangelize a person who's committed to scientism without even being fully aware of it?
I think, how you evangelize anyone is you be in their life consistently and you love them. So that's the fundamental answer. But in my life, I think I would, if I were to comfort a Christian who was doubting their religion because of scientific challenges, myself, a few years ago, then I would just say to them what I learned, and that's what's your name?
My name is Sister Mary Eucharista.
Sister Mary Eucharista. What Sister was talking about of realizing that having a conversation about an ideology in the first place, because I didn't realize it was an ideology. I thought that was just a brute fact that, and not a historically contingent one, but something that had always been, is we justify things through science, and that's it. Like, a justified belief is a scientific belief. Realizing that that is a particular point of view with a lot of problems just really helped me, because it's like, I have a particular point of view with a lot of problems. Now we're playing on an equal field, a level field. And I think if we're going to approach things intellectually, that's what I would do. Is just say, this is a particular way of, and really what Dr. DePalma was doing earlier is like, you're making metaphysical claims. Just pointing that out is like, you're jumping to metaphysics when you don't necessarily have a reason to. So.
I would ask the inverse question too. Are there religious people who don't think they're religious? Because I actually can't understand how somebody could not be religious. A lot of people don't recognize their religion as a religion. Just as a lot of people, yeah. So I mean, it goes both ways in a sense. It's like, yeah.
Well, you're saying that scientism is more of a religion than, I mean, that's basically what you said before.
It's based on religion.
Yeah, I mean,
it's based on faith in science.
Yeah.
And just extrapolating that and absolutizing that. And I mean, I
Talking
faith
that
in
way-
science, but
talking
it's not
that way drives
absolute.
people like Dawkins nuts.
Oh,
But it's true. He even wrote an article on this book, Is Anything Sacred? And he says, it's not that I don't hold things sacred. Well, really? That's my definition of religion.
I think a practical reality though is a lot of people are both. And so you have this very messy, nasty, talking about personal experiences and stuff, like we have a friend who's transgender. So she likes to talk about all these like sociological studies and throughout the biology, all this and that. I was like, well, how do you know that you were a woman in a body? Like, how do you know that? So there's like this weird mash over, and I don't know if you can, is it really about logic? I think it probably just depends on the person. Is it really about logic? Is it about, I don't know.
Well, that's actually, I mean, that it is an epistemological claim. I know that I'm actually a woman. How do I that's a knowledge claim. I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. My gender is female, and my sex is male. So that's an epistemological claim. So you do have to ask the question, how do you justify that? Epistemically, how do you justify that belief? And
Probably not scientific.
probably not scientific. It's actually, it's not. It's introspection, subjective experience. That's how I claim to know pretty much everything. So.
How would you make pleasure? I believe completely you can make all manner of claims about yourself. There are 7.2 billion of us adjudicating counterclaims, for instance.
You want to break open that?
Focus on where we agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think
That'll build trust.
This is a huge claim. Whatever. I'm just going to make it. I think it comes down to tradition, because tradition, etymologically, transdaro means dare. Transdare means to give across or hand down. So tradition is what's handed down from one generation to the next. Tradition is how one generation communicates with the next generation, and every human discipline is based on tradition, including science. If I want to study biology, I'm going to read a textbook that was written by somebody in the previous generation. So, I would argue that through this process of handing things down, then we find out what works and what doesn't, and there are ideas that have stuck around for millennia, and they're like Buddhism and Christianity, for example, are two examples. Like these ideas work for people, and there are very different interpretations of what that means. Like it generates human happiness, which you could take a physical reductionist view of, and so it's like, okay, these two religions are particularly good at evoking a certain brain chemistry. And so it doesn't get you the whole way, But I would argue that over generations, accepting tradition and handling it well, we find out what works and what doesn't work, and that's how we justify things outside of science. And so that's something funny that my wife and I converted to Catholicism less than a year ago, and something I think is funny about the Catholic Church is if something is 100 years old, it's new. And so it's and the Catholic attitude towards things that are less than 100 years old is that might not be wrong. And that's like, so it's a very reserved, but that implies other things like society necessarily moves slowly, and that's kind of, there's a whole thing. Anyway, that's an enormous claim. That is an enormous claim, but that's how I would answer the question.
It's rich, it's communal.
Yeah.
Very much as a socialist.
Very good.
Well, we are at an end of our conversation. Stick around if you'd like to. Let's thank our speakers.